Welcome to Pax Britannica. Season 3, Episode 40. The Protestant Crusade. Welcome back to Pax Britannica. I'm your host, Dr. Samuel Hume. Before we begin, I'd like to welcome new members of the House of Lords. Matthew Tufts, the Marquess of Bordentown, and the Earl of the Old Caretaker's Studio. If you want to join their ranks and listen to the podcast ad-free, go to patreon.com/Pax Britannica. Last time, we covered a disastrous attempted invasion of Hispaniola by the Commonwealth military. Lord Protector Oliver Cromwell's Western Design, the largest and most ambitious military effort ever organised by a British state, had landed on the shores of the Spanish colony. Thousands of soldiers then marched through bone-dry countryside for 4 weeks, harassed by Spanish skirmishers and scouts, and repeatedly ambushed with devastating results. After 3 weeks, the leaders of the expedition decided that their exhausted, dehydrated, famished, sick, and demoralised army couldn't capture a fort, let alone the capital city of Santo Domingo. Another week of miserable preparation followed, before everyone got back on their ships and sailed away. Well, everyone but the dead, the dying, and the defected who were left behind. But the fleet of the Western Design was not going home. This was, in the words of Alice Hunt in her recent book Republic, a Protestant Crusade. God, Providence, had willed that the Spanish Empire in the Americas would crumble, and the expedition was still formidable, at least on paper. Plus, the leaders of the expedition had no desire to return home empty-handed, and so, as part of their preparations to evacuate Hispaniola, they'd cast their eyes over their maps of the Caribbean and decided on the next target. So as the fleet sailed away from the coast which had seen so much failure, they then turned west, bound for Jamaica. Jamaica had not topped the list of potential targets for the design. It was about a sixth of the size of Hispaniola at 4,200 miles, although like its larger neighbour, it was sparsely populated, with around 2,000 people. The majority of these were Spanish colonists, but it also included other Europeans like Portuguese, hundreds of enslaved and freed Africans, as well as a few surviving descendants of the island's pre-colonial population. The geography of the island was also similar, with steep mountains and valleys. Jamaica was, in many ways, a backwater of the Spanish Caribbean. It had received little attention from the Spanish crown. Cuba was a key stopping point for the Spanish treasure fleet. Hispaniola was a hub of administration. Jamaica was neither of these. There was some agriculture, but there was nothing like the boom in cash crops which the other colonies, Spanish and otherwise, had enjoyed. Jamaica's one claim to fame was as the last colonial holding of the Columbus family, who certainly didn't live there, and instead were absentee landlords collecting rent from the island. It was also poorly defended, even less than Hispaniola had been. It was also pretty close by, so 4 days after leaving Hispaniola, the fleet spotted Jamaica. The following day, Thursday the 10th of May, the fleet disembarked in a bay on the south coast, about 5 miles from the colonial capital of Santiago de la Vega. 7,000 soldiers landed under the command of General Robert Venables, some of them enthusiastically jumping off their boats and wading onto the beach. There were Spanish defenders waiting for them, manning 3 or 4 artillery pieces, but a bombardment from the fleet scared them off. By late afternoon, the invasion of Jamaica was well underway, and with a level of success which stood in highly stark contrast to their experience a month before. Maybe it was this contrast which stayed Venable's hand. Was this too easy? Was an ambush waiting for them up the road? If they were still marching as night fell, would his men march in the dark in an unfamiliar landscape? Was it just because he himself was still sick and wanted a night's rest? Whatever his reasons, Despite the army seemingly being ready to follow the fleeing defenders and marching on the capital that very day, they waited until the following morning to continue, and they reached the outer defences of De la Vega at about 2 in the afternoon. Surviving accounts describe earthen breastworks surrounding the town, which would have given the invaders some serious trouble if the small Spanish garrison had held these positions. Notice I said if and would have, because the defences the army walked past were empty, and as they marched into the capital city, they were greeted by silence. Not because the people were stunned into silence by the strength of their arms, but because they weren't there. Santiago de la Vega was a ghost town. Because the English had been here before. A few times, actually. Twice in the Elizabethan golden age of piracy, English piratas had arrived off Jamaica's coasts, plundering and pillaging before sailing away. Just over a decade before this latest visit, an English privateer had captured the town of Santiago as well. But each time, the English had eventually left. These had been raids, disruptive and violent, deadly to some, but something to weather and then move on from. And the Jamaican population had become very good at this. When the fleet had first caught sight of the island, Santiago de la Vega had housed probably about 1,000 people. At other times of the year, this population would have been higher, but at this time, hundreds of townspeople had already departed to farms and plantations across the island. They had had no idea what had been happening on Hispaniola, and so the first warning they had that the English were coming was when they saw the cross and harp fluttering from the masts of Protectorate warships. But like I said, Spanish colonists knew what to do when hostile ships appeared on the horizon. They left. Packing up food and supplies, and any valuables that weren't nailed down, the remaining population within Santiago de la Vega scattered into the countryside. The town was basically empty when the soldiers marched in. The English had been aware of this practice. They'd discussed it during the planning. Part of the reason that the city of Cartagena had been rejected as a target was because of this, and Santo Domingo had evacuated many of its citizens when the English were on their way. But for some reason, this doesn't appear to have occurred to Venables when he decided to pause overnight, or at least it didn't outweigh the risks of a night march. If the army had marched immediately, contemporaries and modern historians believe Venables could have taken over a large part of the population. A clear positive was that the capital of the colony had been captured without a shot being fired. So that's a positive, put that in the plus column. In the negatives, we can put the shortage of food and water in the town, since the fleeing citizens had taken all they could carry. They'd also taken everything of value that wasn't nailed down. But more importantly for the future course of the conquest, a vast source of potential resistance, people who were used to the climate, who knew the terrain and were highly motivated to fight, had just slipped through their grasp. Once the Jamaicans understood that the English weren't planning to leave, that would be a problem. But initially, they had no reason to suspect that this was anything other than a raid in force. 2 leading Spaniards arrived at the occupied town to parley with the English. Venables later claimed that he informed the men that he had come, quote, not to pillage, but to plant. If he had said this, and it was translated correctly, the Spanish didn't seem to have believed it. Of course, these pirates simply wanted food and riches, and then they'd be on their way. Instead, they were surprised to find the English began laying out terms of the colony's surrender to the Commonwealth of England. What followed was a week of haggling. The Spanish governor, sick with syphilis and concerned for his safety, delayed his appearance at the negotiations. There were the usual obstacles of language and religion, but with the added flammability of humiliations both new and old. There's a relish in the English demands which can be attributed to their frustration over the disaster of Hispaniola. We also can't ignore the special hostility of 2 men in the English party, Thomas Gage and Colonel Andrew Carter. Gage was one of the interpreters, and he'd been one of the most passionate supporters of the Western design. As a reminder, Gage had once been a member of the Dominican Order, travelling widely throughout the Spanish Americas, but had since become a fervent Protestant and critic of both Spain and Catholicism. It's easy to see how having him as a translator might have made things difficult. Carter also had a history with the Spanish. He'd been part of the Providence Island colony and had been its governor when the Spanish had arrived to put an end to this pirate haven. Back in 1641, the Spanish had evicted the English settlers, and Carter took every opportunity to remind everyone of how cruelly they had acted. This was the opportunity for Colonel Carter's revenge. The terms of the treaty, which the English preferred to call Articles of Capitulation, clearly derived from the terms which the Spanish had enforced on New Providence. The vast majority of the Spanish population was to be expelled. The objectives of the Western design had given Venables and Penn the ability to incorporate, quote, persons as will submit to our government and willingly come under our obedience. But the English negotiators were of one mind. Spanish Catholics could not be assimilated into proper English Protestant society in any large numbers, so they had to go. The English committed their ships to safely ferry all these former Jamaicans to one of the Spanish colonies on the American mainland. Exceptions were made for those Spaniards with useful skills. They would be welcome to stay behind, as long as they swore not to cause trouble. They would, of course, have to give up the practice of their Catholic faith. All priests and Catholic texts were to be removed without exception. Enslaved and freed Africans were to meet with Venables, quote, to receive some favourable concessions as are intended to be made unto them, touching their liberty, end quote. The evacuated citizens of Santiago de la Vega were to return within a fortnight, with their valuables, and prepared with clothing and food for their journey to their new homes. Wherever that ended up being, the English weren't particularly bothered. The treaty was signed on the 17th of May, with the Spanish delegation held as hostages while the terms were communicated across the island. Just a week after their landing, the English had successfully conquered Jamaica. Were it so easy? On the 17th of May 1655, the Commonwealth of England gained the island of Jamaica. Or at least, that's what the Articles of Capitulation said, and not everyone agreed with them. Of course, the authorities in Madrid disagreed when they heard about them, but more importantly for us, the people of Jamaica disagreed. For starters, the terms of the treaty were disastrous. When the agreement was read aloud to gathered Jamaicans at Bandicoot Ranch, about 40 kilometres west of De La Vega, there was universal outcry. They were meant to just leave, to lose their homes, their farms, their property, including their slaves, and go where exactly? Beyond the difficulties of a forced expulsion, the Spaniards were so suspicious of the heretical English that the idea of putting their wives and daughters on English ships completely at the mercy of English sailors, was an outrageous risk. Sexual assault during the sack of a resisting town or city was one thing, a terrible thing, but an accepted part of war in this era. To quote Pestana, their fears echoed those of the Hispaniola residents who sneaked women out of Santo Domingo, except that the cases differed. To brutalize women being transported under the terms of a treaty would have been a gross contravention of the widely respected rules of war. Spanish suspicions in this circumstance revealed the depth of their wariness towards the English invaders. End quote. There wasn't much to like in the terms of the treaty, and many wondered why exactly they had to stick to them. Because the Jamaicans had had a week to evaluate the strength of their uninvited guests. The negotiators came back and forth between De La Vega and Bandicoot Ranch, as did several other colonists, and familiarity very quickly bred contempt. The English force was massive. That was clear from the start, and closer inspection didn't alter the raw numbers. But over that week, the Spanish saw indisputable proof that beyond their sheer numbers, this was not an overwhelming military force. The soldiers were sick and hungry and dying. Information that couldn't be gleaned from simple observation was acquired in other ways. Hungry and thirsty soldiers on guard duty could be plied for information in exchange for food and drink. The Spanish also seized one of the English interpreters, a young man called Payne, who spoke both English and Spanish. From these sources, the Jamaicans learned all about the disaster on Hispaniola, that the leadership was divided, that the men were demoralized, that this overwhelming force had been defeated by the climate and a couple hundred men. So, why exactly do we have to follow the terms of this treaty? 2 days after the treaty was signed, and Penn, Venables, and Gregory Butler had returned to the comfort of the fleet, they received word that things weren't going to plan. The Spanish colonists weren't coming to Santiago de la Vega to submit to transportation. They were running away. The villages, ranches, and plantations nearest to the city were emptying as Jamaicans retreated further inland. They were rejecting the treaty, heading into the hills and bush. From what we can gather from surviving evidence, the Jamaicans divided into 2 groups, those who wished to stay and fight, and those who wished to flee. That latter group, mostly women, children, and the elderly, made their way to the north coast of the island, and in small boats made the 104-mile crossing to Cuba. Some of these boats were caught by English patrols, who naturally robbed them of anything they had of value before sending them on their way. Most of these dispossessed Jamaicans settled at Santiago de Cuba. The other group of Jamaicans, who decided to stay, had encouraged the others to leave. They were preparing for a guerrilla war, and it would be easier with their families safe in Cuba. Camps in the mountains and bush were established, weapons and supplies gathered, and scouts went to watch the invaders. At some point, though not immediately, the resistance split along racial lines, as slaves, freedmen, and others of African and Native American descent broke off to form their own camps. None of them expected this would be a long-term struggle. The only question was whether the heretics would wither away from the climate, hunger, and disease before Madrid sent forces to wipe out this infestation in the heart of Spanish America. This was all, shall we say, awkward for those Spanish leaders kept as hostages by the English. As the Jamaicans were violating the terms of the agreement, their lives were now forfeit. The reports of the commissioners make clear that they believed they would have been absolutely in the right if they'd had the colonial leadership shot. It wasn't clear how involved the elites were in the treachery of their subjects, but that they chose not to. But, other than shooting the hostages, the English had to respond. Not straight away, because they had learned about the resistance on the Sunday, and Venables was a godly man. But on Monday, he took a boat back to shore and began preparations to mop up this opposition. The general put Colonel Buller in charge of 1,500 men and dispatched him out of Santiago de la Vega to catch the Jamaicans on the road. Another 700 men were embarked onto ships and dropped off down shore. Both efforts were too late. All the soldiers found were mounted horsemen who easily outran the infantry forces. They returned to the capital to report their success in driving away the enemy. But of course, that hadn't been their mission. The soldiers in De La Vega continued to starve, with supplies from the fleet few in number, and foraging parties picked off by the locals. Disease had gone exactly nowhere, and men fell sick in large numbers. The English soldiers were now facing a guerrilla war, and several veterans noted how this all reminded them of campaigns in Ireland or the Highlands of Scotland. Now you might be thinking, why was the supply issue so bad? Wasn't the design meant to be about settlement as much as conquest? And you'd be right to think so. But setting up a colony was a complicated business, which is why the Western design had included, among its leadership, an expert. Edward Winslow, the former governor of Plymouth Plantation, had been brought along just for that reason. But unfortunately for everyone, but especially Winslow himself, the 59-year-old had come down with a case of, death. It appears that during the old governor's brief trip to the army camp on the River Haina, where he had urged the soldiers to attack again, He'd caught one of the many diseases which were ravaging the expedition. A few days before the fleet had spotted Jamaica, he'd been buried at sea. His experience was lost with him. But Winslow's was not the only experience the English had. They began to carry out a strategy which had already been carried out in the settlement of Ireland. Regiments were scattered across the region, garrisoned in the now abandoned farms and plantations, with two aims. The first was to prevent the Jamaicans from coming back. They wanted to live in the mountains? Go right ahead. The second was to put this land to use. The soldiers would farm the land they were stationed on, doing as best they could with the limited experience many of them had of tropical agriculture. In the medium term, this strategy hoped to force the Jamaicans to surrender to the English occupation for transportation. Some did at this stage, but not many. Meanwhile, Admiral Penn sent 3 ships north on a 5-month voyage to New England to purchase supplies. It didn't take 5 months to sail there and back. It took 5 months to wait for the harvest, and then to bake the grain into biscuit, and then to wrangle with local merchants who knew a captive market when they saw one and hiked the prices. The first ships arrived back in Jamaica in November, and the third arrived as late as January. By this point, things were only barely looking up. More than one soldier tried to get on the next ship back to England or Barbados, and some admitted they had illegally fled from apprenticeships or other responsibilities just in the hope they'd be sent back. No such luck for them, since they didn't have the privilege of rank. Because of the 3 commissioners present in Jamaica, Robert Venables, William Penn, and Gregory Butler, none of them were still there by the time that first ship returned from New England. The first to go was Penn. His logic was that, until Jamaica was fully conquered and the Western design was ready to attack another target, the vast majority of his fleet would be better placed in Europe. Some could be left behind to patrol the coasts and enforce the Navigation Act, but the rest were wasted, just floating off Jamaica with nothing to do, which all made sense. What Penn would face criticism for was the fact he wanted to go with them. After the fact, Penn would insist he'd only left because Venables and Butler persuaded him to go, whereas Venables insisted he'd begged Penn to stay. There's no evidence one way or the other, but it took a month to prepare for the return voyage. Part of those preparations was careening the ships, that is, tilting them on their sides on a beach to clean the hulls of barnacles and undertake repairs. When a ship was careened, anything heavy they carried, like supplies or guns, were removed to make the whole thing easier. At Jamaica, these supplies were put on other ships, and one of those ships was the 30-gun Discovery, which abruptly exploded. Survivors recounted how sailors had been drawing brandy from a barrel when the high-proof liquor caught a naked flame. The fire spread quickly, reaching the ship's magazine, and, well, you can work out the rest. Now down a ship, and whatever supplies couldn't be recovered from the sea floor, the return voyage prepared to set sail on the 21st of June, only for the winds to decide otherwise, keeping them in port for another 4 days. Penn left William Goodson as his deputy, commanding 12 ships. They finally set off, now reduced to half rations, on the 25th. 3 weeks later, during a service of Thanksgiving, the 54-gun Paragon caught fire and detonated too. Hundreds were killed outright. The voyage continued miserably for another 6 weeks before the first of Penn's fleet sighted England. Back in Jamaica, it wasn't long after Penn's departure that Venables did that thing where he slapped his knees, said "right," and said his goodbyes. He later gave his reasons for why he had to head back to England. Firstly, he was sick. Really sick. Honest. He had a doctor's note. He also thought that the soldiers really needed an advocate in England, someone who knew what they were suffering, and who would make sure they were paid, in cash, not in land, as had happened in Ireland. There is also the possibility that Venables did not entirely trust Penn. The two men don't appear to have been at each other's throats as much as traditional histories have argued, but they did have their disagreements. and things had not gone entirely to plan, to put it lightly. When Penn got to London, what if he told everyone that it was all Venable's fault? After all, the Navy had done its job. It was the Army's fault for being cowards in Hispaniola and being slow in Jamaica. However, the records show much more suspicion from Venables towards Butler rather than Penn. The two men had got on fairly well until they reached Jamaica, and in that brief time they had had multiple public arguments. Words were said, accusations made. Butler was really not Venables' biggest fan. Venables was worried that when the other commissioner went home, he'd get his revenge and place all the blame at his feet. And so Venables deputized Richard Fortescue to continue the campaign and boarded a ship alongside Butler, and set off. Unlike Penn, their return voyage was uneventful, or at least their ship didn't explode. The three commissioners returned to London, where the Lord Protector was waiting. Cromwell had been kept very well informed about the disasters, as we shall cover next time, and so he was not very happy. What had meant to be a Protestant Crusade, which swept the Catholic Spanish out of the Americas, had instead conquered a small town on a small island and was now engaged in an exhausting guerrilla war. Venables attempted to spin this as a grand victory. A colony had been founded at the heart of the New World. Cromwell had both Penn and Venables arrested and thrown into the Tower of London, through Traitor's Gate. Penn was released fairly quickly after accepting his responsibility for the failures, though he was discharged from the military and would never again serve in the Commonwealth forces. But we will see him again. Venables tried to argue his case, publishing a defense of his role in the design and, essentially, saying it was everyone else's fault. For those left behind in Jamaica, the situation was a hellish combination of, to paraphrase Pestana, a botched military campaign and a badly planned colonial project. The death toll was horrific. In the first few months, between 40 and 100 soldier settlers died each week. By November, after 6 months on the island, one letter states that half the original force was dead. By January, the army had reduced from almost 8,000 to fewer than 3,000. These deaths included Thomas Gage, who perished shortly after the Articles of Capitulation were drafted. When the Jamaican resistance scouted out their old farms, they often found their garrisons of 30 or more men were already dead. More reinforcements had arrived by the end of 1655, but by July of 1656, an official census listed 2,598 soldiers. There was little opportunity to leave, and virtually no opportunity to desert. This was an incredible death rate. Half of the army was dead within 6 months of their arrival, and 3/4 were dead within 5 years. And it wasn't limited to the rank and file. Death is the great leveller, and he was busy in Jamaica. Colonel Fortescue, left in charge by Venables, died in October 1655 after just 5 months on the island. The new governor of the colony, appointed by Cromwell, Robert Sedgwick, arrived that same month, and lasted 7 months before perishing from disease in May 1656. The Lord Protector sent another governor, William Braine, who arrived in December 1656 and did the best so far. He survived for a whole 9 months, dying in September 1657. These are scenes very reminiscent of long-ago episodes on the starving times in Virginia or the disastrous early steps of other colonies. But in terms of raw numbers, these early years in Jamaica outshone all previous colonial death traps. Tropical and other diseases ran rampant through the European population, made all the worse by their poor diet and unhygienic living conditions. Even settlers brought from other Caribbean colonies died in vast numbers. 1,600 colonists from the island of Nevis came to Jamaica in November 1656. Within a year, that number had dropped to 400. It took until 1658 for the colony to stop hemorrhaging lives, but basic survival would continue to be the priority. And all the while, the Spanish resistance was waging a guerrilla war against their occupation. However, it's important not to let the unavoidable tag of consolation prize detract from what this was. This was an unprecedented seizure of an existing colony from its European overlord. The English had never done this before, because it was no small thing. Though Spain officially claimed sovereignty over the whole Caribbean and beyond, and the English had ignored that claim many times, they'd usually done so by settling places without a Spanish presence. The Lesser Antilles, or Bermuda, were on the fringes of the Spanish colonial empire, on small islands which the Spanish usually wouldn't bother investing significant resources to expel them from. There were exceptions, like Providence Island, but the English settlers there had actively antagonized the Spanish through privateering. The conquest of Jamaica, like the conquest of Hispaniola would have been had it succeeded, was unprecedented. It was the first time that a British state had embarked on empire building with all of its resources and attention. It would not be the last. Next time, we will take a look at how the Lord Protector was kept informed about the goings-on in the world, and spend some proper time with one of the most interesting people of this period, John Thurlow, Cromwell's spymaster. Thank you to my House of Lords, including the King's favourites Mike Sanders and Fernando Lopez Ojeda, the Duke of Pembroke, Amir Latifi, the Marquis of Hampton, Alec Travis, and the Earl of Lincoln, Adam Foote. Go to patreon.com/Pax Britannica to join their ranks and listen to the podcast ad-free. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, you can also access the ad-free feed through a membership there. Pax Britannica is part of the Airwave History Bundle. Remember that you can join the mailing list to get news about the show by going to the link in the description. For other great podcasts on the Airwave Network, check out airwavemedia.com. Thank you to Sounds Like an Earful for the interval music in today's episode, to my entire House of Lords, and to you for listening.